When you hear the word power, what immediately springs to mind? Is it something rigid, maybe concentrated in the hands of just a few, or does it feel more fluid now, sort of everywhere, influencing things constantly? Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating journey into the nature of power itself. We'll be anchoring our discussion in Max Weber's classic definition of the nation state, sure, but crucially, building on Moises Naim's insights from his book, The End of Power. Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack how power has fundamentally transformed and what these huge shifts mean for, well, maybe the ultimate power player of the last few centuries, the nation state. You've provided some incredibly rich source material, and we're definitely ready to dig in.
Yeah, absolutely. And to set the stage, let's start with the bedrock, as you said. Max Weber's classic definition of the nation state. He famously described it as the sole entity holding the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its own borders. That was, for a long time, the foundation. But the crucial question now, and Naim really tackles this head-on, is whether the nation state genuinely maintains that unique sovereignty, that legitimacy, and that monopoly on power today. Is that claim still holding true?
That's a really powerful way to frame it. Okay, so before we jump into the end of power, or maybe the state losing its grip, we need to agree on what power actually is. The source material mentions that George R. R. Martin, quote, power resides where men believe it resides, which is interesting, definitely speaks to perception. But the more academic definition we're using focuses on the capacity to influence people's decisions. Is that always direct, though? Like an order?
Exactly. It's about guiding decisions, and importantly, not just through direct action, like issuing a command, but also, sometimes more subtly, by changing conditions or perceptions around those decisions. The nation-state became what it is because it historically had this immense power to influence its citizens' decisions, right? Guiding them to act in ways that reinforce the state's authority. And this is where Naim's work gets truly fascinating. His central idea is this. Power isn't really held by large, singular monopolies anymore. Instead, it's become much easier to get, to acquire power. But, and this is the paradox, it's significantly harder to hold on to, harder to use effectively, and maybe surprisingly, also easier to lose.
That really flips the script on how we usually think about power, doesn't it? It's less about who has it permanently and more about who can navigate this, well, more volatile landscape to keep it. So it's less about building that impenetrable fortress of power.
Right, exactly. It's more about agility, adaptation. Because historically, those in power relied on what Naim calls traditional barriers. Think about scale, just being big enough to muscle out competitors. Or historical legacy, where past power just sort of reinforces present power. And tradition itself, the idea that power wasn't for just anyone. Naim argues these barriers have largely eroded. Power is just much more accessible now to many more actors. The source even uses that analogy, someone shouting, "Power is mine now." That captures how the nation-state once felt it had seized power, but that feeling, it's shaky now. And Naim attributes this radical shift, this erosion, to several key developments. He sums them up as three interconnected revolutions that really took off after the Cold War ended, and crucially, with the internet becoming widespread.
Okay, the end of the Cold War definitely changed the global stage, a multipolar world, more players. But the internet, yeah, that feels like the real amplifier here, allowing, what did Naim call them? Bulletproof, immortal ideas. Ideas spreading globally, information access like never before. So how do these connect to the three revolutions?
They connect directly. These catalysts led straight to what Naim terms the more revolution. It's simple, really. There's just more of everything. More people, yes, but also more diseases, more products, more crises, more chaos, and critically, more alternatives for people. Two, the mobility revolution. Everything moves faster. Money, people, goods, services, and maybe the most potent ideas and information. Borders are just more porous. And three, the mentality revolution. This one is really disruptive for states. It's not just that people have more information, it's the sheer volume, the mix of truth and fiction. It makes it incredibly hard to know what to believe. This fundamentally chips away at the state's traditional role as the source of truth, People's loyalties are just harder to win, harder to keep. Gaining that citizen allegiance. Profoundly difficult now.
That point about loyalty erosion is huge. If the nation state traditionally operated on a kind of social contract, we give you security, justice, welfare, you give us loyalty, how have these revolutions specifically weakened that deal, made that loyalty so much harder to come by?
That social contract is definitely under immense strain. And these shifts, they aren't abstract. They directly affect how power gets used through what Naim sees as four main channels, and critically how the nation state is losing its tight grip on each one. Joseph Nye talked about hard power, coercion, and soft power, persuasion, even smart power. Names framework gives us a slightly different lens. First, the club, quasi-coercion. Brute force, military, sanctions, classic hard power. Second, the carrot, Havaku reward, influencing by offering benefits, incentives. Third, the law, Yas authority, power from legitimacy, rules. Think of the phrase, by the power vested in me. People obey laws, constitutions, not just from fear, but belief in the system. Fourth, advertisement, reclam, persuasion, conviction. This isn't just billboards. It's the deep ability to persuade, to convince people to be loyal, to buy into an identity. And the source makes a great point. Even dictatorships, terror groups, everyone needs persuasion to keep their members loyal, not just force.
That's a useful breakdown of how power operates. But is there a point where, say, persuasion starts to feel coercive, even without overt force? Does name draw a hard line, or is it more of a spectrum in practice?
It often is a spectrum, yeah. The lines can definitely blur, which adds to the complexity, but name's crucial point remains. These revolutions are weakening the nation-state's traditional dominance over all four channels. Other actors, non-state actors, are getting better at using them, or finding ways around state control altogether.
And that brings us right to this consequence. The rise of small actors wielding, well, disproportionate influence. We've seen hackers, right? Things like WikiLeaks, major cyber attacks. They can genuinely shake state institutions by leaking massive amounts of data. Or think about social media influencers today. Sometimes they seem to have as much persuasive power as political leaders, mobilizing huge numbers of people, completely bypassing traditional channels.
Absolutely. And it's not just digital. You see terrorist organizations using relatively simple tech like commercial drones, homemade explosives. They can challenge powerful states. The London bombings are a tragic example. This dispersal leads to a new kind of danger, this pervasive instability and uncertainty. Because power isn't concentrated in just a few predictable places anymore, it's much, much harder to anticipate what might happen next. That old idea of, a few elites in a deep room pulling all the strings, it seems less plausible when there are so many different actors, all with some leverage.
It's almost paradoxical, isn't it? The technology meant to connect everyone also empowers fragmentation and challenge. What does that mean for everyday citizens? Beyond security threats, does it affect our sense of shared identity or just trust in institutions?
That's a deep question. It likely means living in a state of more constant flux. Which brings us to the central question, really for us and for our aim. Can the nation-state, as we've known it, actually survive these challenges? And if it does, how is it adapting? Well, think about it from your perspective as citizens. You historically gave up certain rights to the state in exchange for things like protection, justice, welfare, right? The state's ability to actually deliver on those promises, internally and externally, that directly fuels your trust and loyalty. If it fails, say, it uses force effectively against its own people but seems powerless against outside threats, or can't provide basic services, those bonds weaken. But it's important, as Nye suggested about the U.S., the nation-state isn't just sitting back passively. It does have significant capacity to adapt. It's fighting back, in a way.
Okay, so how is it fighting back? What specific maneuvers are we seeing nation-states try to adapt and maybe claw back some of that diffused power?
We're seeing several key strategies. One is revisiting identity politics. States are trying to reimagine and promote national identity in ways that resonate with today's tech and global realities. They're also trying to leverage technology themselves, using government agencies, state tools to engage people on social media just like influencers do, trying to remind them of that national identity. And the source rightly stresses the state still has big advantages: infrastructure, legal authority, resources, also strengthening crisis response. We see populism rising, maybe less faith in international bodies, so states are trying to step up so they can intervene effectively in crises. That's an attempt to regain legitimacy through action. The ones that succeed in renewing loyalty this way will likely do better.
It also feels like a constant push and pull with expectations.
Totally. They're adjusting expectations. What the state demands from citizens today is way less than in, say, the 1800s. But what citizens expect from the state, much, much higher. It pushes states into what some call that narrow corridor, a really tricky balancing act. And finally, trying to engage the global citizen. People aren't just defined by borders anymore. Perceptions, values are changed globally by algorithms. States have to use tech not just to broadcast, but to understand and meet the needs of this sort of global human, offering new reasons for allegiance beyond just old-school patriotism. Whether individual states succeed, that remains to be seen, but the struggle is definitely ongoing.
We've really covered a lot of ground today, looking at these shifting sands of power through Weber and especially Moyes' name. It seems clear the dynamics have fundamentally changed. Power is easier to get, definitely harder to keep, harder to use well, and yeah, easier to lose for those traditional players.
Exactly. And the nation state, which we often think of as this fixed, all-powerful structure, is right in the middle of this ongoing dynamic struggle. A struggle for relevance, for adaptation, in a world where power just won't sit still.
So, thinking about all this, what really stands out to you, the listener, as nation states keep trying to adapt or maybe fail to adapt to this new power landscape, what kinds of loyalty, what forms of governance might emerge? It's a powerful thought, isn't it? How these huge shifts ultimately filter down and shape our own lives and our collective future.